Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate and a special interview on Friday's budget with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, let me quote you some of the things that have been said about the budget. It's been called a missed opportunity. They say it has no vision. They say it's just a lot of little things that don't add up to very much. And then on Friday, it's been called the second worst budget in India's history. How do you respond to that sort of criticism?
You know, I think it's very important to realize that we spend too much energy focusing on the budget. I mean, we're in a difficult situation, and I think somehow there's an expectation that a budget could somehow tackle all these problems. I think that's wrong. You do need the budget to do some important things right. Most of the things that need to be done are actually outside the budget. So a lot of the feeling that the budget hasn't done this, the budget hasn't done that, I think misread what a budget is meant to do.
So in other words, we expect too much of the budget?
I think so.
Okay, let me ask you a simple question about this budget. What would you say are the three most important measures announced by the budget, or are there none at all?
No, that's a good question, so let me give you just three. Number one, it quite clearly acknowledges that the fiscal deficit went out of line, and I think the finance minister deserves a lot of credit for sort of coming out with what it's like, and then lays out a sort of roadmap for the next 3 years.
You mean there was a real possibility he might have not been upfront about it?
Well, you know, I wouldn't have put it that way, but for the last 6 months, people have been speculating that the fiscal deficit is obviously going to be exceeded. That's true, by the way, everywhere, because growth has slowed down. But so I think he came up front, and I mean, he put together a fiscal deficit number and a fiscal deficit target, not only for the coming year, but for the next two, which is actually more realistic than what was there earlier. So
what are the other two?
Second, I think he's given a very strong signal, and it's not as if that does everything, but a very strong signal that the infrastructure sectors need support. You need to get on with investment in those sectors. Plus, there are lots of other things we have to do with infrastructure which will happen. So I think that's an important message.
And here the important step is the increase to 60,000 crore of tax-free bonds in particular, as well as permission to borrow from abroad.
Yes, those are budget-related, plus the fact that the infrastructure debt fund, which was an initiative worked on over the last year, is now done, and the first of them have taken off. So that was important.
And the third?
I think the third very, very important signal, in my view, which is related to tax reforms, is that he's brought in the concept of a negative list on service tax. I mean, the GST would have done something like that anyway. And the finance minister has given a signal that, look, on the things we control, that is the service tax, which is a central tax at the moment, we're willing to take the steps necessary to go ahead.
So it's a small but important step forward.
Well, I wouldn't call them small. I think the GST, the service tax, if you see that as a credible guide to the fact that GST will happen, okay, that would be a very big step forward.
Let's for a moment concentrate on the manner in which the finance minister has tackled the fiscal deficit. You've given him credit for being upfront and admitting boldly just how bad it is. In fact, it turned out to be much worse than most people's expectations when he announced it was 5.9%, which is why the first question people ask is, can he really reduce it to 5.1%, given that he was so wrong last year and he was out by 1.3%? Can he be correct this year? Because he has no control over oil, and the oil price, given the Iran-Israel situation, could easily climb to $150 a barrel.
Well, I think, you know, any budget is always made on the basis of some assumptions about things beyond one's control. And I would definitely agree with you that if you see a huge change in oil prices, budgets not only in India but everywhere would have to be rethought. But I'm hoping that this fear that there will be a crisis, etc., will abate, and what you'll see is oil prices roughly where they are now. I think what you mentioned earlier, and that's there in his speech, is that he said, I'm going to cap the subsidies at 2%. This is a very important step also.
It is, no doubt, but I'll come to that in a moment's time. Let me first point out that it's not just the uncertainty of the oil price that raises question marks about whether he can meet his fiscal deficit target of 5.1%. Another set of doubt comes from the fact that his gross borrowing requirement is 5.7 lakh crore this year, almost 60,000 more than it was last year. His expenditure has gone up by 22%. And if he cannot achieve the 7.6% GDP growth that he's predicted, then he's not going to achieve 5.1% on the fiscal deficit. And given the external situation, and given the sort of disappointing response internally, people question whether 7.6% growth is possible.
No, that's a very reasonable issue, that the budget is always based on a projection of growth targets. So the key question is going from this present year's 6.9, I think will get revised to 7% when the full data come out. So let's just say, will 7% go to 7.6%? I think it's tough, but I think it can be done, assuming that you don't have some kind of huge explosion externally which disrupts everything. Now, why do I think it can be done? I believe that one of the most important things that's holding back investment in the country is that in the energy, coal, power, gas area, big projects are stalled. Now, these are not things that can be sorted out in the budget, but efforts are being made separately to take care of this.
And you're assuming those efforts will be successful?
I believe there's evidence of progress there, and I think you need to give it another 3 to 4 months to see whether what we now know are steps being taken will actually lead to a successful outcome.
All right, I can see why you have reason to be hopeful and confident, but clearly for the audience, the jury's out on that one till those projects actually fructify. Let's come to the issue you mentioned, which gives you a second reason of confidence that 5.1% on the fiscal deficit can be met, the fact that he's put a cap of 2% on subsidies. The problem is, no doubt he's put a cap, but he has no roadmap to indicate how that will happen. And many people say this is just hope and ambition, not a realistic target.
Well, again, this is another reason why one cannot, I think, do everything in the budget. What you need in order for that cap to be strictly observed is that depending on what happens to prices, both in the case of fertilizer and in the case of petroleum prices, some adjustment takes place. Now, he's not said when it's going to be done. It's not actually in his control. It's a government decision. The Prime Minister, I think, on television said that this is a bullet we must bite. But what he's laying out very clearly is that the rationale of the government's policy requires some action to be taken.
But in fact, this is the third reason why people are doubtful that 5.1% can be met, because no doubt the PM on television said we must bite the bullet, but people fear that biting that bullet could end up breaking your teeth. And the reason is this: you're talking about very steep, if not draconian, increases in petroleum price and perhaps even in urea. Are you prepared to face up to Mamta's wrath when those steep price increases happen?
Well, I think Finance Minister addressed that issue, and it's a difficult issue. I mean, this is a coalition government, so it's not something where they can take some tough decisions without holding the coalition together. They will have to consult, they will have to discuss, they will have to persuade people and the public in general, and indeed the opposition.
Well, let me tell you why I think this is a particularly difficult one. I'm going to go to numbers to prove my point. The budget is based on the assumption that the price of oil will be somewhere between 110 and 115 a barrel. It's already over 120. Secondly, the finance minister's only set aside 43,000 crore as an oil subsidy, which is 36% less than last year's figure of 68,000 crore. So he's either assuming that Indians will use a lot less of petroleum products, or they will be prepared to pay a lot more. That's why it's a difficult one.
It has to be the case that the underlying assumption is that the difference between global prices, which is the price we pay, and the domestic price, they'll be narrowed. Now, unless global prices fall, and that's very unlikely because, as you say, right now, they're above the level that we are calibrating, it does mean that domestic prices have to be adjusted.
And sharply, that's the point.
Well, I mean,
and Mamta will be howling.
Well, you know, my point is that if you subject the government to skepticism on the grounds that there is no way that any sensible policies can be passed through with a consensus, then, I mean, it's not just the budget, everything else also.
But practically everything else that Mamta's objected to, the government's had to give in over. She objected to FDI and retail, the government gave in. She objected to oil price increases in November, the government gave in. She doesn't like the pension bill, it's stalled. She doesn't like the Lokpal, that's stalled. Every time she objects, the government gives in. That's why I say, when you push up petroleum prices in the draconian levels that are required, she will object and the government will fail.
No, I think the only thing I can say is that this is, as it were, a bullet they have to bite, and they have to do the consensus gathering that is necessary.
Actually, what they need when they bite this bullet is another pair of dentures, because the first time around they'll break their teeth.
It always looks difficult in a politically difficult situation. Nobody quite says they're going to agree to something unless they agree to it and until they're ready. So the real question is, these consultations, will they be useful or not? I hope that they will be able to get an agreement. That's all I can say.
What you're saying is the uncertainty will linger and perhaps get worse until the actual bullet is bitten.
I think that's absolutely correct.
But let me give you a second reason why people are doubtful of this 2% cap on subsidies. Where in this feature does the food security bill, which could cost 1 lakh crore itself, fit in? People say either the food security bill is not on the anvil for this year at all, or the 2% subsidy cap is not sacrosanct.
No, I think the finance minister has made that very plain. He said the food subsidy will be fully funded. Now, exactly when the bill will be passed, when it is made operational, this is something I can't guess about.
But if he fully funds it and still sticks to the 2% cap, then the money left for petroleum and urea is reduced to so little that the increases will be so steep that Mamta will blow a fuse.
Let's say that's substantially correct, that the more we do by way of commitment on food subsidy, the less will be available within the cap for the other subsidies. But I do think that a finance minister who makes a commitment that, look, I want to limit subsidies to 2%, and within that, food security is my top priority, and leave it to me how I adjust the rest, I think that's taking the debate a little bit further forward. I mean, for example, if in Parliament, it's not the finance minister who can do it. You need a political consensus. If there's a political consensus that 2% is a reasonable limit, then he has a sort of a mandate to get it done. People say not 2, make it 2.2, that's okay too. But I think this is the right way to go. Let's agree on what the cap is. Let's agree that food is the most important. I mean, that's what Amartya Sen constantly says. And let the rest take the hit.
Absolutely, and you're now depending upon a consensus that is at the moment elusive. Whether it comes about in the next 4 months, 6 months, 1 year, who knows? But what you're saying is that we need that consensus to give the finance minister the spine to stand by 2%.
Well, not the spine, he has the spine. To give the finance minister an environment in which he can do what he said he's going to do.
Let me very quickly point out another reason why your 5.1% fiscal deficit figure might be questionable. The increases in indirect taxation, which is going to bring about an additional 45,000 crore of revenue, are going to kick up inflation. Secondly, whatever happens on the petroleum front and perhaps even on the urea front will further kick up inflation. That will make it very difficult for the RBI to reduce interest rates, as a result of which growth will be stifled, and so your revenue projections could go wrong. Once again, 5.1% may be in doubt.
I don't, by the way, accept that logic. I know that very often people say that, if you raise indirect taxes, inflation will go up. It may be true that the individual price on which a tax is borne in the short run goes up. But please remember, what he's doing is two things. He's raising indirect taxes and he's reducing the fiscal deficit. Now, the reduction in the fiscal deficit has a lot of other impact which tends to moderate inflation.
But the reduction in the fiscal deficit depends upon 7.6, and if that 7.6 is stifled because inflation is high and interest rates remain high, then 7.6 won't happen.
No, that's a very good point, but let's take that up. I think the news on inflation, if anything, is good. I mean, look at it.
But it could get worse.
It could always, anything can always get worse.
In fact, it will, because of the excise duty and service tax and because of petroleum prices.
No, because I think the increase in the excise duty in an environment where the fiscal deficit is being brought down will raise some prices but need not lead to an overall increase in inflation. So
this is an exaggerated fear?
I would say it's an exaggeration. It is a fear that is caused by far too many talking heads on television screens making instant comments within a 10-minute environment and not keeping macroeconomics in mind.
All right.
Now, let me just...
Let me stop you there. that little dig with a smile on your face is a hint to me to take a break, time to stop this particular conversation and stop panicking people with exaggerated fears, as you call them. But I will point out there are others who say it's not exaggerated, and come back and put you what many consider to be the worst part of the budget, the decision to retrospectively amend the 1962 Income Tax Act 50 years after it was passed to overturn the Supreme Court judgment on Vodafone. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and a special interview with the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, let's come to what many consider to be the most controversial part of the budget. The announcement in the budget papers, not in the budget speech, that the government intends to retrospectively amend the 1962 Income Tax Act 50 years after it was passed to ensure that the Supreme Court judgment on Vodafone is overturned by making it possible to tax overseas transfer of shares in Indian companies by Indian authorities. I put it to you, this is unfair, possibly immoral.
Well, I don't want to comment on the impact on any particular company, but I think what they've done is dominantly is to change the law. And I think objectively that particular change is not only an appropriate one, it's something they had signaled in the DTC. They were going to do that anyway. And it's something which many, many other countries have.
But why are you doing it retrospectively?
No, this is the issue that what you're raising, I've not gone into it detail, but I've seen a little bit. It does say that it will be effective retroactively. What that will do in any individual case, I really don't know. I mean, as a general rule, I agree with you that one should avoid retrospective amendments, but...
you said something very important. Generally, one should avoid retrospective amendments.
I think that's fair, I think, generally. But
many people wish that was advice the finance minister would heed.
Well, let me say, this is not something where nobody had any idea and you go off and amend something retroactively. This is an issue that's been discussed in courts. The government won at the High Court.
The government lost at the Supreme Court.
Lost at the Supreme Court.
That's what makes it even more painful.
No, what's more is that the Supreme Court said, I don't know enough about this, and in a way I shouldn't really be commenting on something that might be
The Supreme Court said that the government should clarify.
Yes, they said it should clarify.
But not retrospectively. The Supreme Court wanted it prospectively.
This is an issue, if it is going back, if the matter is being considered, these are issues that no doubt the court will take up.
Let me put to you, by way of illustration, why people think this is hugely unfair. Coincidentally, on Friday, Sachin Tendulkar scored his 100th century. But if in the afternoon, when he was still poised at 99, the ICC had announced a change in cricket rules and thus declared that he was only standing at 82 centuries and not 99, there would have been howls of protest. That, in effect, is what the government is doing to Vodafone.
No, that's a very clever way of putting the government's case as if it's equivalent to denying Sachin his 100th century, which, of course, by the way, the finance minister himself congratulated Sachin on.
But it's equivalent to denying fairness and fair play.
No, I mean, a complex, detailed legal issue, I really don't want to comment on.
Okay, but comment on this. Don't go into the legalities, don't go into the complexities. Comment on this. Deepak Parekh, a leading businessman who's very close to your government, has gone on record to say that this is totally retrograde. He says the impact on India's credibility and reputation will be extreme.
I'm aware that there's been very negative reaction. I'm sure the finance minister is also aware of it. I do not know what action the ministry intends to take in that particular case. I don't know what the court is going to pronounce on it. So, as I said, most people tend to regard a retroactive amendment as undesirable.
Can I put two quick questions to you? What impact do you think this retroactive amendment will have on foreign investment? Won't it put them off?
I think, no, this is important. Clearly, whenever you have a retroactive amendment which affects an individual, that individual will certainly feel, that he's been treated unfairly. But I think foreign investors should have absolutely no doubt in their mind that, the government of India does not intend retroactively to change some of the basic conditions. This, by the way,
but you need to give that as an assurance rather than just a comment in an interview.
Well, I'm not in a position to give that assurance, but I don't think, I mean, let me put it this way. In this particular, in all tax matters are always very complex. And I think foreigners would look at the total experience they have with the Indian tax.
You hope they look at the total experience rather than focus on this.
No, I'm sure they will.
Can I put one last suggestion before we end the interview? Would it not help the situation if the Finance Ministry were to announce that although this is a retrospective amendment, they will not reopen the Vodafone case on the basis of amending the law? That would give people a lot of assurance.
I'm sure that would, and let me say that...
You agree it would?
I'm sure it would, but the point is, I don't know what the thinking of the ministry is on this. Let me say, there's an implication in what you're saying that they should not use it, not only for Vodafone, but for any other thing. I've no doubt, by the way, and this is very important, that prospectively, this change is actually quite sensible.
But retrospectively?
Well, as a general rule, I'm personally uncomfortable with retrospective things. Now, you know, when ministries do that, they usually have some very good reason. And I just don't know enough about what the reasoning is.
But as you said, personally you're uncomfortable with retrospective changes in the law. A hint from the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission is enough for a wise man. Let me end this interview there. Montek Ahluwalia, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.